The room is cold, not the sharp, clean cold of a modern winter morning, but a heavy, damp chill that feels like it's clinging to the very marrow of your bones. It's a grey morning in London, though morning is more of a suggestion than a reality. The light is weak and bruised, struggling to push through a thick mustard-coloured fog that clings to the glass. You can taste the air before you even fully wake up. It's a gritty, metallic cocktail of coal smoke, horse manure, and the damp scent of river mud. You pull the blanket tighter, but it offers little comfort. The wool is coarse, scratchy, and holds a persistent dampness that suggests it hasn't been truly dry since the previous autumn. You can hear your own breath, a soft rhythmic huff in the stillness of the small room. Outside, the world is beginning to stir, but the sounds are muffled by the heavy atmosphere. You hear the rhythmic, hollow clop of iron-shod hooves on wet cobblestones, and the distant, lonely cry of a street vendor who sounds like they've already given up on the day. Your fingers brush against the wall next to your palette, and you feel the rough, uneven texture of peeling lime wash and the cold, weeping stone beneath it. This is your reality, a space defined by shadows and the peculiar, oppressive silence of a city that has grown too fast for its own good. Before we begin our journey into the shadows of the past, take a moment to settle in. Like this video only if you genuinely enjoy these stories, and subscribe only if you find yourself wanting to return to these quiet, cynical corners of history. And let me know in the comments, where are you listening from tonight? And what time is it for you? It is always fascinating to see where the night has found you. Now, let the modern world fade into a distant memory. Let the hum of electricity and the glow of screens dissolve until all that remains is the flickering light of a dying hearth and the weight of a century that didn't care if you could breathe. Congratulations, you've just woken up in the year 1865. The good news? You're alive. The bad news? Your home is a masterpiece of bureaucratic cruelty, designed by people who believe fresh air is a luxury you simply haven't earned. You are currently lying in a tenement, a word that sounds much grander than the reality of a single room shared by you, your family, and a persistent colony of damp-loving mould. To understand why your eyes are stinging and your chest feels like it's being squeezed by a heavy iron band, you have to look at the windows, or rather, the lack of them. You see, for the last century and a half, the geniuses in the British Parliament decided that the best way to fund their global ambitions was to tax the very concept of light. It was called the window tax. The logic was beautifully simple and utterly heartless. The more windows a house had, the wealthier the owner must be. If you were a lord in a manor with 50 windows, you paid for the privilege of seeing the sunrise. But if you were a landlord looking to maximise profit in the slums, you realised very quickly that windows were a liability. You look up at the wall where a window should be. Instead, there is a rough patch of brick and mortar, poorly finished and cold to the touch. Your landlord, a man who likely spends his evenings in a well-lit club complaining about the laziness of the poor, decided that walling up your light was cheaper than paying a few shillings to the government. This has turned your living space into a brick box. The air doesn't move. It just sits there, fermenting with the smell of the charcoal brazier you use for heat and the stale scent of yesterday's cabbage water. Temperature-wise, the room is a paradox. Near the floor, where you sleep, it's a drafty, shivering cellar. Near the ceiling, the heat from the cooking fire traps the smoke and the carbon, creating a thick, invisible blanket that makes your head throb. You breathe in, and the air feels heavy, like it has weight, carrying the fine black dust of the London sky into your lungs. There is no cross breeze. There is no escape. The tax on light and air was technically repealed a few years ago in 1851, but bricking a window up is a permanent act, while unbricking one costs money that your landlord refuses to spend. So you live in the after dark, even at noon. You navigate your room by touch, the splintered wood of the table, the cold iron of the kettle, the dampness of the floorboards. The government in Westminster didn't care about your vitamin D levels or your eyesight. They cared about the Treasury. They essentially legislated blindness and tuberculosis into the building codes of the working class. You hear a soft scratching sound in the corner, a rat perhaps, or just the house settling further into the marshy ground. The sound is sharp against the silence. You realise that in this era, home isn't a sanctuary. It's a set of rules you have to survive. The elite believe that if you are poor, you should be grateful for any roof at all, even one that keeps you in perpetual twilight. They call it the character-building nature of hardship, while they sit by their floor-to-ceiling bay windows in Belgravia, watching the sun hit the silver on their breakfast tables. The texture of the air is the most inescapable part. You try to clear your throat, but the sound is dry and echoed by the empty hallway outside. You are a victim of a system that decided light was a taxable commodity, and as you sit up on your rustling straw mattress, you realise that the sun is a stranger to this room. The walls are weeping with condensation, a slow, cold drip, drip, drip that sounds like a clock counting down the hours of a shift you aren't ready to start. As you stand up from your straw pallet, your joints give a sharp rhythmic pop that seems to echo too loudly in the confined space. You aren't just living in a room, you are living in a back-to-back. To the architect of the Industrial Revolution, this was a stroke of genius, a way to fit the maximum amount of human labour into the minimum amount of expensive real estate. To you, it feels like living inside a lung that can't quite catch its breath. In a back-to-back house, you share 3 of your 4 walls with your neighbours. There is the family to your left, the family to your right, and the family directly behind you, separated by a single layer of porous, soot-stained brick. This design was born from a rule that prioritised industrial density over the basic laws of physics. Because you have no back door and no back window, the air has nowhere to go. It enters through the front door, if you dare leave it open, and then it simply stays, swirling in the corners, growing warmer and heavier as the day progresses. The temperature in here is a fickle beast. Even on a cool morning, the combined body heat of the 6 people sharing this room, plus the low-grade warmth of the neighbour's hearth on the other side of the wall, creates a humid, cloying atmosphere. You feel a thin sheen of sweat on your forehead, but your feet, resting on the uneven, unwashed floorboards, are still numb from the draft that sneaks in under the door. It's a sensory map of a system that views you as a component rather than a citizen. You move toward the door, guided by the sound of a distant, metallic clanging. It's the sound of the street pump. In 1865, your housing rules dictate that you don't actually own your water. You negotiate for it. Every morning you have to grab your heavy iron bucket and join the queue. The handle of the bucket is cold and gritty, the wrought iron biting into your palm with a texture like frozen sandpaper. The smell hits you the moment you step into the narrow alleyway outside. It is a thick, multi-layered stench that defines Victorian urban life. First, there is the sharp, acidic tang of horse urine from the main road. Then there is the heavy, sweet rot of the dust heaps, where ash, vegetable scraps and things better left unmentioned are piled up, waiting for a collection that might not happen for weeks. But underneath it all is the damp, earthy smell of the cesspool. You see, the building codes of this era had a very out-of-sight, out-of-mind approach to sanitation. Beneath the shared courtyard of your tenement block sits a massive brick-lined pit, Every resident of the 20 rooms in your building uses the same 2 privies, which sit directly over this cavern of human waste. The rule for the night soil men who are supposed to empty these pits is that they can only work under the cover of darkness, usually between midnight and 5 in the morning. This isn't for hygiene, of course. It's so the finer sensibilities of the wealthy residents 3 streets over aren't offended by the sight or smell of the city's reality. You reach the pump and wait your turn. The air here is slightly thinner, but it carries the metallic scent of the iron pump and the faint, sulphurous smell of the Thames, which isn't far away. You watch your neighbour pump the handle. Creak, thud, splash, creak, thud, splash. It is a rhythmic, mechanical sound that sets the pace for the entire neighbourhood. When it's your turn, you grip the lever. It's slick with a film of algae and the grease of 1,000 unwashed hands. You pump, and the water that emerges is not clear. It has a slight greyish tint, a cloudy texture that suggests it has travelled through a system that hasn't been cleaned since the Great Fire. You've been told by the authorities that if you pray hard enough and keep your house morally upright, the water won't kill you. This is the Victorian version of public health. If you get cholera, it's a failure of your character, not a failure of the pipes. You breathe in deeply, and the cold water splashes against your knuckles, a sharp, stinging sensation that wakes you up more than the weak sunlight ever could. You can hear the sounds of the city intensifying, the distant roar of a steam whistle from the docks, the barking of a stray dog, and the constant low-frequency hum of thousands of people living too close together. The texture of your life is defined by these shared struggles. You share your air, your water, and your filth, because the rules of the city were written by men who own land they never have to stand on. To them, the housing problem is a series of ledger entries. To you, it is the weight of the bucket in your hand and the knowledge that every drop of water is a gamble. You turn back toward your door, your breath visible in the alleyway's damp shadows, carrying your heavy prize back to the dark room where the mould is the only thing that truly flourishes. You step back over the threshold of your building, and the temperature drops instantly. It's a strange, subterranean chill that has nothing to do with the weather outside. It's the chill of the brick. You see, in 1865, your house was built using a process the newspapers called jerry building, though you just call it a trap. The rules for building these houses were written by men who treated bricks like gold and human lives like gravel. The walls around you are only 1 brick thick. There is no insulation, no cavity, no barrier between you and the damp London earth. You put your hand against the hallway wall as you navigate the darkness, and the texture is startling. It's slick. A fine, cold slime has coated the plaster, a mixture of condensation and rising damp. This is a structural feature of your life, because your landlord saved money by skipping the damp-proof course. A simple layer of slate or bitumen that would stop water from wicking up from the marshy soil. The house is effectively drinking the ground it stands on. The smell here is concentrated. It's the scent of slow rot. It's the smell of wet timber, ancient wallpaper paste fermenting behind the surface, and the faint sweet odour of crumbling lime. You breathe it in and it feels like a physical weight in your chest. A humid pressure that makes your breath come in shallow, careful hitches. You've noticed that everyone in this building has the same tenement cough? A dry, hacking sound that punctuates the silence of the night? A rhythmic reminder that the house is slowly migrating into your lungs. The sounds of the house are a language of their own. As you climb the narrow, winding stairs, the wood groans under your weight with a high-pitched, splintering protest. The stairs were built on the scant, meaning the builder used the thinnest, cheapest wood possible. You can hear your neighbour in room 4 turning over in their bed. The sound travels through the floorboards as if they were made of parchment. You hear a child crying 3 floors up, and the sound vibrates through the hollow walls, a ghostly, distant wail that never seems to stop. The elite architects of the Metropolitan Buildings Act claim that these structures are wonders of modern efficiency. They write long, self-congratulatory pamphlets about how they've provided shelter for the industrious classes. But as you reach your door, you look at the frame. It's warped. The house is settling into the mud of the Thames Basin, tilting ever so slightly to the left. The door doesn't quite fit the hole it was made for, leaving a permanent gap at the bottom. This gap is where the street breath enters. It carries the texture of the outside world, a fine black soot that settles on everything. You run your finger across the small table where you keep your few possessions, and you feel the grit. It's industrial snow, the byproduct of 1,000 coal fires and steam engines. The rules of the city state that you are responsible for the cleanliness of your dwelling, yet the city itself breathes filth into your room every second of the day. It's a perfect circular logic of bureaucratic cruelty. The system creates the grime and then blames you for living in it. You set your bucket of greyish water down. The thud is dull and heavy. You realise that your entire sensory world is dictated by a landlord's profit margin. The temperature of your skin, the smell of your clothes, the very air you are allowed to process, it has all been scanted. You are living in a machine designed to extract work and return only enough space to collapse in. You sit on the edge of your mattress, listening to the house creak as the morning wind hits the roof, a sound like a great wooden ship straining against an anchor it can't see. As you settle back onto the edge of your mattress, the room feels smaller than it did 10 minutes ago. This is because the temperature has begun to climb. In a Victorian tenement, the laws of thermodynamics are governed by the number of souls packed into a single square fathom. You are not alone in this room. You are never truly alone. The housing of the working classes rules have a very specific definition of what constitutes a family, but the reality of 1865 is that space is a currency you can't afford to spend on privacy. The air in the room is starting to thicken, losing the sharp edge of the morning chill and replacing it with a heavy human warmth. It's the smell of unwashed proximity. It's the scent of damp wool coats hanging on hooks, the sharp saltiness of dried sweat, and the faint, sweet musk of breath that has been recycled through 6 pairs of lungs throughout the night. You breathe in, and the air feels like a warm, wet cloth pressing against your face. It's the sensory evidence of a system that decided connectedness was a physical requirement for the poor. And you reach out and touch the surface of the mattress. The texture is a nightmare of industrial thrift. It's a coarse, burlap-like ticking stuffed with flock, a polite term for the shredded, dusty floor sweepings of the textile mills. The rules of the General Board of Health suggest that bedding should be aired daily, but where would you air it? Outside, the soot is falling like black flour. So you live with the flock. As you shift your weight, the mattress gives a dry, dusty crunch. You can feel the sharp prickle of a stray piece of straw, or perhaps a tiny, jagged bit of wire that escaped the mill. The sound in the room is a rhythmic, involuntary symphony. There is the low, wet rattle of your cousin's chest, a sound the doctors call the phthisic, but you just know as the sound of someone who has spent too many winters in a wall-less room. There is the soft, papery rustle of the straw as someone else turns over, and the distant, constant drip of the condensation from the ceiling into a cracked ceramic bowl. Plink, plink, plink. It is the ticking clock of the tenement, measuring the slow erosion of the building. The elite members of the Social Science Association often meet in ventilated halls to discuss the moral dangers of shared sleeping quarters. They write intense, furrow-browed reports about how the promiscuous huddling of the poor leads to a decline in national character. They believe that if they pass enough rules about occupancy per cubic foot, they can legislate away your misery. But their math never accounts for the fact that a room with 6 people stays warmer than a room with 1, and in a winter with no coal, morality is less important than not freezing to death by midnight. You watch your own breath hitch as someone in the hallway bangs a bucket against the wall. The sound is sharp, metallic, and vibrates through the floorboards, tickling the soles of your feet. You were part of the lodger system. The rules state that your landlord must register this room if he takes in more than 2 unrelated persons, but the inspector hasn't been seen in this district since the last great smog. To the system, you are an unseen occupancy. You exist in the margins of the law, a ghost in a brick box, paying 4 shillings a week for the privilege of hearing your neighbour's every heartbeat. The texture of the morning is one of slow-motion crowding. You feel the pressure of the walls, the weight of the air, and the intrusive sound of a city that never stops demanding more of you. You are a biological unit in an experiment designed by men who believe that human dignity is something you only earn once you have a certain amount of capital in the bank. You close your eyes for a moment, listening to the heavy, synchronized breathing of the room, a sound like a great tired bellows trying to keep a dying fire alive in the dark. As the human heat in your room continues to rise, you find your mind drifting to a memory of a winter night just last year. You had been between jobs, your coins had vanished into the pockets of a previous landlord, and you found yourself subject to the Vagrancy Act of 1824. This was a rule written by men who believed that being poor wasn't a tragedy, but a criminal offence. According to the law, sleeping in the open air was an act of rebellion against the state. If you didn't have a roof over your head, you were a rogue and a vagabond, and your punishment was the treadmill. So you had sought shelter in a 4-penny coffin. This was a model of housing designed by philanthropists who wanted to prove that you could provide charity while still turning a modest profit. To the elite, it was a sanctuary of the industrious poor. To you, it was a box of nightmares. The temperature in the lodging house was a suffocating, oily warmth. It was the heat of 80 men packed into a basement, their damp clothes steaming in the torchlight. You can still smell it if you close your eyes. The sharp, nose-stinging scent of disinfecting powder, which was mostly just lime and ambition, mixed with the heavy, sour odour of unwashed wool and the metallic tang of old tobacco. You breathe it in, and it feels like a thick paste coating your throat, a sensory reminder that in Victorian London, even your breath is communal property. The texture of your bed was the most memorable part. For 4p, you were given a wooden box, a rectangular frame barely wide enough to hold your shoulders. The wood was rough, unfinished, and held the splinters of a dozen previous occupants. Inside the box was a mattress made of American cloth, a cold, slick, waterproof canvas that felt like sleeping on the skin of a dead shark. There was no pillow, only a thin, scratchy blanket that felt like it had been woven from the hair of an angry goat. The sound of the lodging house was a relentless, low-frequency roar. It was the sound of the communal snore, 80 men all breathing, wheezing, and coughing in a synchronized rhythm that made the very walls of the basement seem to vibrate. You hear the sharp clack of a boot hitting the floor, the groan of the wooden frames as people shifted in their sleep, and the distant rhythmic ticking of the warden's clock. Tock, tock, tock. It was the sound of a system that counted every minute you were allowed to exist under its protection. The rules of the lodging house were a masterpiece of petty control. You were forbidden from talking, forbidden from smoking, and forbidden from manifesting unseemly behaviour. At exactly 5 in the morning, the watchman would enter the room and ring a heavy brass bell. This wasn't a wake-up call, it was an eviction. The rules stated that for your 4p, you only owned the box until dawn. The moment the bell rang, the industrious poor were returned to the street, regardless of the sleet or the fog outside. There was a cheaper option, of course. There was a penny sit-up. For 1 penny, you weren't given a box. You were given a seat on a long wooden bench. The rule was that you could sit there all night, but you were strictly forbidden from lying down. To ensure you complied, the wardens would stretch a heavy tar-coated rope across the room. At chest height, you would lean forward, draping your arms over the rope, and sleep hanging like a row of wet laundry. It was the rope rule, a design that prioritized posture over peace. The texture of that rope was a jagged, oily cord that bit into your chest and neck. The smell was the sharp chemical scent of Stockholm tar. You can hear the sound of the rope straining under the weight of 20 sleeping men. A rhythmic creaking that sounded like a ship's hull in a storm. If you slipped, the rope would jerk against your throat, a sudden choking reminder that even your sleep was being regulated by the laws of gravity and bureaucracy. You blink and you're back in your tenement room in 1865. The rope rule and the coffin box are just different chapters in the same book of rules. The elite believe that by making your rest as uncomfortable as possible, they are encouraging you to work harder. They think that luxury is the parent of laziness, and so they ensure your life is texturally abrasive. You run your hand over your coarse mattress, and the dry flock inside crunches under your palm, a sound like dead leaves in a gutter. You are a citizen of a city that has mapped out your misery with the precision of a surveyor, ensuring that every hour of your day and every inch of your skin is subject to the heavy, damp weight of the Victorian improvement. You move toward the small wooden cupboard in the corner of the room, the one your landlord proudly described as a ventilated larder. The temperature in this specific corner is several degrees lower than the rest of the room, but it's a treacherous cold. In 1865, the bureaucratic wisdom of the age, dictated by the Metropolitan Building Act, suggested that food should be kept in a space that has constant contact with the outside air to prevent the stagnation of humours. The rule meant the builder had to leave a permanent gap in the exterior brickwork, covered only by a thin perforated zinc sheet. The result isn't a fresh breeze, it's a direct delivery system for the London fog. You open the cupboard door and the smell of industrial dinner wafts out. It is the scent of rancid suet, the sharp vinegary tang of pickled onions used to mask the taste of fading pork, and the ever-present heavy aroma of damp soot. It's a smell that feels like it's coating your nostrils with a fine, greasy film. The texture of your food is a testament to the city's environment. You reach for the remains of a loaf of standard bread. Your fingers brush against the crust, and it feels like sandpaper. This isn't just because it's stale, it's because a fine layer of coal dust has filtered through the zinc ventilator and bonded with the moisture in the bread. You breathe out a short, weary sigh, and you can see the faint cloud of your own breath against the cold interior of the larder. The sound of your breakfast is a series of small, unsettling noises. As you move the bread, you hear the frantic, scratching skitter-skitter of a mouse behind the wainscoting. In the tenement, the rules of sanitary living state that a householder must keep their premises free from vermin, yet the very architecture of these houses, with their hollow lath and plaster walls, was designed as a high-speed highway for rodents. You hear the neighbour's cat shrieking in the alley below, a sharp, piercing sound that cuts through the low-frequency rumble of the morning traffic. The elite members of the Select Committee on the Adulteration of Food spend their days in wood-panelled rooms debating the chemistry of what you eat. They write long indignant papers about the fraudulent addition of alum to flour, or the colouring of cheese with red lead. They believe that if they pass enough acts, they can ensure the purity of the national stomach, but their rules don't account for the pantry paradox. Even if your food starts pure, the housing rules force you to store it in a box that breathes the toxic exhaust of 1,000,000 chimneys. You break off a piece of the bread and the sound is a dry, splintering crack. You can feel the grit of the coal dust between your teeth, a texture that gives every meal a faint metallic aftertaste. The system has decided that ventilation is the cure for all social ills, so it has legislated a hole in your wall that turns your butter into a soot sponge. The air in the corner of the room is thin and carries the sharp ozonic smell of the coming rain. You realise that your larder is simply a shelf for the city's waste. The rules are followed, the zinc sheet is in place, and the inspector can tick his box while you chew on the literal dust of the Industrial Revolution. You take a shallow breath, feeling the cold air from the zinc vent hit your throat, a sharp reminder that in this room, even the act of keeping your food is an exercise in surviving the very rules meant to protect you. You find yourself standing at the top of the stairs, the greyish morning light trickling down from a cracked skylight that is more spiderweb than glass. The temperature here is a damp, clinging humidity. It is the kind of air that feels like it's trying to condense into liquid on your very skin. You are heading toward the courtyard because in 1865 the housing of the poor rules have a very specific, very cruel relationship with basic biology. You step out into the small rectangular space between the brick walls. The texture under your feet is slick. The flagstones are coated in a fine, dark moss that survives on a diet of shadows and overflow. The rules of the Metropolitan Commission of Sewers state that every dwelling should have access to a sanitary convenience, but their definition of convenience is what you would call a tactical assault on the senses. The smell hits you with the force of a physical blow. It is the great stink in miniature. It's the scent of an ancient cesspool, a heavy, ammonia-rich odour that seems to vibrate in the back of your throat. It is mixed with the smell of wet soot and the metallic, bloody scent of a nearby slaughterhouse. You breathe in, and the air is so thick with particulate matter that you find yourself instinctively breathing through your teeth, trying to filter the miasma. You reach the shared privy, a small sagging brick hut in the corner. The door is made of rough-hewn pine, grey with age and splintered at the edges. You touch the latch and the iron is cold, wet and slightly oily. Inside, the temperature is surprisingly warm, a stagnant biological heat that feels wrong against the damp courtyard air. The sound inside is a low, constant buzzing, the rhythmic humming of 1,000 flies that have made this space their cathedral. The elite members of the Royal Society for the Encouragement of Arts, Manufactures and Commerce often write long, poetic essays about the miasma theory. They believe that disease is carried by bad smells, that if the air smells sweet, the body is safe. Their solution isn't to fix the pipes, but to mandate the use of aromatic powders. The rules state that your landlord is supposed to provide lime to sprinkle over the waste, but lime costs money, and your landlord views your health as a private luxury he is under no obligation to fund. You can hear the sound of the city's plumbing, a rhythmic drip, glug, drip coming from a lead pipe that has burst somewhere behind the wall. The sound echoes in the small space, a watery heartbeat that measures the city's decay. You look at the floor and you see the texture of the communal wipe, discarded scraps of the Illustrated London News or the Police Gazette, their ink smearing in the dampness. The rules of the refined world say that reading is the path to enlightenment, but in the tenement, the newspaper is just a rough, ink-stained tool of survival. As you step back out into the courtyard, your breath hitches. You hear the distant, hollow thump of a night soil man's cart being loaded 3 streets away. These men are the ghosts of the rulebook. They are the only ones allowed to handle the city's shame, and only during hours when the respectable citizens are dreaming of velvet and lace, you realise that your entire morning has been a journey through a landscape of ignored regulations. The rules are written in gold in the Parliament, but they are executed in lime and shadow in your courtyard. The texture of the air as you walk back toward the stairs is one of unresolved pressure. You feel the weight of the city's waste, the weight of the damp brick, and the intrusive buzzing sound of the flies. You are a resident of a world where sanitation is a word used in speeches, while stench is the reality you are forced to inhale with every rhythmic, labouring breath. You climb the stairs, the wood groaning beneath you, and the smell of the courtyard follows you up like a loyal, invisible dog. You return to your room, your boots making a dull, wet thud skelch on the floorboards that seem to have absorbed the very essence of the London winter. The temperature in the centre of the room has shifted again. It is no longer just cold, it is ash dry. You move toward the small iron grate that serves as your hearth, your kitchen, and your only defence against the creeping damp. In 1865, the rules of the house dictate that warmth is a commodity you buy by the bucket, and the Coal Acts ensure that the middleman gets his cut before you get a single spark. You reach for the coal scuttle. The texture of the fuel is oily and jagged, rough lumps of sea coal that leave a stubborn black stain on your calloused fingers. This coal isn't the high-grade anthracite burned in the West End. It's the sulphur-heavy dross of the northern mines, the kind that burns with a thick yellow flame and a smell that reminds you of a blacksmith's forge in a rotting lemon. It is the smell of the hearth rule, a pervasive acidic scent that clings to your hair, your skin, and the very fibres of your wool shift. You kindle the fire. You can hear the rhythmic crackle pop of the coal as the heat finds the pockets of ancient gas trapped inside the stone. Your breath, once a visible cloud, begins to steady as a small radius of warmth pushes back against the room's heavy shadows. But this warmth comes with a bureaucratic price. You see, the building codes of the mid-Victorian era have a strange obsession with flue diameter. The Chimney Sweepers Regulation Act was supposed to stop the use of climbing boys, the small, soot-covered children who were forced up the narrow vents. The rule stated that all new chimneys had to be built with wider, more accessible flues. However, your landlord, in his infinite industrial thrift, found a loophole to avoid the cost of rebuilding. He simply let the old, narrow flues stay, but he narrowed the fireplace openings with cheap fire bricks to increase the draft. The result is a system that works like a vacuum for your money and a radiator for the sky. Most of the heat goes straight up the chimney, while the smoke, frustrated by the narrow exit, often decides to lounge in your room instead. The sound of the fire is a low, wheezing hiss. It's a mechanical sound, like the house itself is on a respirator. You breathe in, and the air is dry and tastes of sulphur. It catches in the back of your throat, a texture like fine hot needles. This is the tenement lung, a condition the elite physicians at the Royal College of Surgeons attribute to the moral intemperance of the lower orders, rather than the fact that your housing rules force you to breathe the exhaust of a poorly designed brick box. Lighting is your next challenge. The grey morning has failed to provide enough light to see across the room, so you reach for a dip. This is a tallow candle, the only lighting allowed by your budget and the chandler's regulations. The texture is greasy and soft, the animal fat yielding under your fingernail like cold butter. The smell of a tallow dip is unmistakable. It is the scent of a slaughterhouse that has been turned into a wick. It's a heavy, meaty odour that lingers long after the flame is extinguished. The elite members of the Metropolitan Board of Works are currently experimenting with gas lighting in the streets. They stand under the warm, steady glow of the new lamps, admiring the triumph of progress. They write rules about the safety and illumination of public thoroughfares. But inside your tenement, the rule is shadow or stink. The dip burns with a fitful, smoky orange flame that dances in the draught from the door. You can hear the soft rhythmic sizzle hiss as the melting fat hits the wick. The light it provides is more of a suggestion than a reality, casting long distorted shadows of the furniture against the weeping walls. The sound of the street is beginning to change. You hear the knocker-up, the man hired to wake the district, tapping his long bamboo pole against the windows of the workers. Tap, 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 tap. It is a rhythmic, percussive sound that signals the end of the night soul's reign and the beginning of the industrial grind. Each tap is a reminder that in this city, even time is a rule you have to follow. You sit by the fire, your hands hovering over the grate. The texture of the heat is prickling and uneven. Dew. You feel the warmth on your palms while the back of your neck is still subject to the draft rule of the warped doorframe. The air in the room is a swirling map of temperature and soot, a sensory evidence of a housing system that was designed to store bodies rather than sustain lives. You take a breath, feeling the dry, smoky air fill your chest, and you realize that your home is simply a place where the rules of the city come to rest for the night. You watch the orange light of the tallow dip flicker, a tiny struggling heart in the center of a world built on coal dust and bureaucratic indifference. You move toward the corner of the room where a heavy sodden bundle of fabric lies in a wooden tub. The temperature in this corner is a clinging, humid warmth that feels vastly different from the dry heat of the coal fire. It is the steam of the poor. In 1865, your life is governed by a set of regulations known as the bylaws of public decency, and these rules have a very specific, very frustrating relationship with your laundry. You reach into the tub to pull out a heavy wool shirt. The texture is punishing. It's waterlogged, weighing 3 times what it should, and the fibres are stiff with yellow soap, a harsh, lye-heavy compound that leaves your skin feeling tight and waxy. The smell is a sharp, nose-stinging mixture of animal fat, caustic soda, and the deep, underlying scent of stale wash. You breathe in, and the humidity feels like a damp rag being pressed against your windpipe. It is a thick, oxygen-poor air that makes your breath come in heavy, wet hitches. The sound of your work is a rhythmic, wet slap-slosh thud as you wring the fabric by hand. There are no mechanical wringers here. Your own muscles are the only machine the rules allow. As the water hits the floorboards, you hear the soft, porous soak of the wood absorbing the overflow. In a tenement, the floor is never truly dry. It is a permanent sponge for the city's moisture. The elite members of the Society for the Improvement of the Condition of the Labouring Classes frequently tour these districts in their carriages. They write long, moralizing reports about the visual blight of linen draped across the streets. To these men, a hanging bedsheet is a sign of social disorder. Consequently, the rules of your parish forbid you from hanging your laundry in the alleyway or from your window. To do so would be to invite a fine you cannot pay or a visit from the beadle who views a drying sock as a personal insult to the Queen's dignity. So, the housing rules force you to do the impossible. You must dry your laundry inside the same single room where you eat, sleep, and breathe. You stretch a line of rough hemp rope from the bedpost to the cupboard. The rope groans with a high-pitched fibrous creak as it takes the weight of the sodden wool. The sound of the room changes instantly. The laundry acts as a series of heavy, wet curtains that muffle the noise of the street but amplify the sound of the house. You hear the rhythmic drip Drip, drip of water falling from the hem of a skirt onto a piece of oilcloth. It is a slow, hypnotic sound that measures the passing of the hour. The temperature begins to climb as the moisture evaporates into the stagnant air. It becomes a London indoor fog, a cloying white mist that smells of wet sheep and lye. The elite physicians at the General Board of Health publish pamphlets advising you to keep a constant flow of fresh air to prevent the accumulation of damp. But, as you know, the window tax of the previous decade ensured there is no air to flow. You are trapped in a biological loop created by a bureaucracy that demands you be clean, but forbids you from showing the world how you achieve it. The texture of the air on your tongue is metallic and sweet. You feel the dampness settling into your own clothes, turning your dry shift back into a clammy, clinging layer against your skin. You are a resident of a system that views public decency as a higher priority than your ability to avoid pneumonia. You stand in the centre of your room, surrounded by ghostly, dripping shapes of wool and linen, listening to the fire hiss as a stray drop of laundry water hits the hot coal. A sharp tissist that signals the endless conflict between your need for warmth and your need for hygiene. The temperature in the room is a dense animal warmth, a humid blanket of shared existence that pools in the corners and clings to the low ceiling. You are attempting to sleep, but in 1865 your rest is not a private affair, it is a matter of municipal statistics. You are currently a subject of the Common Lodging Houses Act, a set of rules crafted by men who believe that, if they can measure the air you breathe with a ruler, they can prevent the moral decay of the empire. Just as your breath begins to slow into the rhythmic heavy cadence of deep sleep, a sound shatters the stillness of the hallway. It is a sharp, authoritative crack, 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 the sound of a heavy wooden truncheon hitting the warped pine of your door. It is the sanitary inspector's knock. The rules of the city give these men the right to enter your home at any hour of the night to ensure that you are not over-occupying your 4 shillings worth of space. You sit up, and the texture of the room shifts instantly. The cold air from the hallway rushes through the gap in the doorframe, hitting your face like a wet slap. You smell the inspector before you see him. He carries the scent of officialdom. It is a mixture of starched linen, expensive tobacco, and the sharp chemical odour of the carbolic soap he uses to scrub away the memory of his visits to the slums. It is a clean, aggressive smell that feels like an intrusion into the sour, familiar musk of your room. The inspector enters, carrying a bullseye lantern. The light is a cold, piercing white circle that sweeps across the room, illuminating things you'd rather keep in the shadows. It hits the damp patches on the walls, making the weeping lime wash glitter like crushed diamonds. It catches the eyes of your cousin who is squinting against the glare, and the rhythmic, panicked scratching of a bedbug fleeing the light. The elite members of the Statistical Society of London are obsessed with cubic capacity. They believe that every human being requires exactly 300 cubic feet of air to remain morally upright and physically industrious. To them, your room is not a home, it's a container. The inspector pulls a long brass-tipped measuring tape from his pocket. The sound of the metal tape sliding out, a long, shrill scree vibrates in your ears, a mechanical cry that measures the limits of your life. He moves through the room with the cold precision of a surveyor. You can hear the rhythmic thud-thud of his polished leather boots on the splintered floorboards. He touches nothing with his hands, using his cane to poke at the bedding. The texture of his presence is one of sterile judgment. He is here to enforce the lodger rule, which states that no more than 2 adults of the same sex, unless married, may occupy a single bed. He peers into the shadows, checking the ages and genders of the people huddled on the straw. The irony of the system is not lost on you. Lord Shaftesbury and his colleagues in the House of Lords write long, tear-jerking speeches about the promiscuous huddling of the poor, yet the housing rules they uphold ensure that you can never afford a room large enough to avoid it. The system creates the crowding and then sends a man with a lantern to fine you for it. You breathe in, and the air feels thin and dusty, stirred up by the inspector's movement. It's an air that tastes of chalk and bureaucratic indifference. Hear the scratching of his quill on a pre-printed form, a dry, persistent scratch that sounds like a beetle in the wall. He is recording your deficiencies. If he finds one person too many, the rulebook dictates that someone must be turned out into the fog. The law doesn't care if the street is freezing or if the excess body has nowhere to go. It only cares that the cubic capacity of the room is satisfied. The rules of 1865 prefer a cold dead body in an alleyway to a warm, living one in an unregistered room. The inspector finishes his measurements. He doesn't look you in the eye. To him, you are just a unit of occupancy. He turns and leaves, his boots echoing down the stairs in a rhythmic, retreating cadence. The door slams shut, and the sound is hollow, shaking the very frame of the house. The temperature begins to settle back into its stagnant human warmth, and the smell of carbolic soap slowly fades, replaced once again by the heavy scent of damp wool and old soot.
You lie back down, your heart still thudding against your ribs.
The texture of the mattress feels more abrasive now, as if the inspector's tape measure had sharpened every piece of straw inside. You realize that in the eyes of the law, your existence is a mathematical problem to be solved with subtractions. The rules are designed to improve you, yet they only succeed in making your rest feel like a crime. You listen to the synchronized breathing of the room, return to its slow, heavy rhythm, a sound like a great, tired beast hiding in a cave, waiting for the sun to rise on another day of regulated misery. The light in your room is changing. The grey morning has deepened into a dull, leaden afternoon, and as the shadows shift, they reveal the one thing in your room that was supposed to represent aspiration. You look at the wall, and for a moment you see a flicker of vibrant emerald green. This is your wallpaper, or at least the few patches of it that haven't been claimed by the damp. The temperature near the wall is a peculiar, clammy cold, as if the plaster itself is trying to pull the warmth out of your fingertips. The Victorians have a very specific set of rules when it comes to the aesthetics of the home. Even in a tenement, there is a societal pressure to surround yourself with the symbols of the natural world, a desperate attempt to ignore the fact that the nearest blade of grass is 3 miles away, buried under a layer of horse dung and railway soot. Your landlord, in a rare moment of philanthropic decoration, covered the weeping limewash with a cheap floral patterned paper. It features a repeating design of ivy and ferns, rendered in a colour known as Shields green. You lean closer, and the smell of the wall hits you. It isn't just the damp or the soot. It is a faint, unmistakable scent of garlic. To the elite chemists of the Royal Society, this scent is a fascinating scientific curiosity. To you, it is the smell of the house slowly exhaling poison. You see, the rules of the market dictate that brilliance must be cheap. To achieve that stunning garden-like green, the manufacturers used arsenic, ton upon ton of it. The texture of the wallpaper is dry and powdery. You run your hand over a leaf, and a fine green dust comes away on your skin. This is the breath of the fern rule. Because your room is damp, thanks to the lack of a damp-proof course and the window tacks holes in your brickwork, the moisture reacts with the starch paste behind the paper. It feeds a specific type of mould that converts the arsenic into a toxic gas. You breathe in. and your breath feels metallic and sharp. You've noticed that your eyes are always watery, and your throat feels like it has been rubbed with nettles. The system has decided that your need for a cheerful environment is best served by coating your walls in a chemical weapon. The sound of the wallpaper is a soft, rhythmic rustle flap. It is the sound of the paper peeling away from the weeping stone, a slow-motion shedding of the room's skin. You can hear the dry, papery sound of a piece of ivy curling up at the edges, revealing the black, furry mould beneath. It's a mechanical sound, like a very slow, very patient predator uncurling itself. The elite members of the Ladies' Sanitary Association publish home improvement guides for the poor. They suggest that a tasteful interior leads to a tasteful soul. They believe that if they can just get you to admire a green leaf on a wall, you'll stop wanting to spend your coins on gin. They write rules about domestic elevation, but they never mention the arsenic ache, the persistent bone-deep fatigue and the skin sores that come from living inside a green-tinted poison cloud. The bureaucracy of the age cares more about the appearance of your morality than the reality of your lungs. You turn away from the wall, and your gaze falls to the floorboards. You are currently on the first floor, but beneath you lies the subterranean rule. In 1865, the Metropolitan Local Management Act has very strict regulations about cellar dwellings. The rule states that no one is allowed to live in an underground room unless it has a ceiling at least 1 foot above the street level and a window that can be opened. It sounds like a humane regulation, a victory for the public health movement. But the reality of London is a masterclass in architectural loopholes, because the demand for space is so high and the housing rules are so rigid, the cellars have simply been rebranded. Your neighbour downstairs lives in a kitchen, which, according to the ledger, isn't a bedroom at all. Therefore, the rules about light, air and ceiling height don't apply. The temperature down there is a permanent, grave-like freeze. You can hear the sound of the street through the floorboards, the rhythmic splosh-squelch of the passing carts pushing the liquid filth of the gutter against the cellar's single tiny pane of glass. The smell of the floor is a heavy, earthy odour, the scent of the Thames Basin mud that is slowly reclaiming the building. It is mixed with the sharp, acidic tang of the waste that leaks through the street-level brickwork. You breathe out, and you feel the vibration of the house as a heavy omnibus passes outside. The sound is a deep, thundering rumble boom that rattles the ceramic bowl on your table and shakes a few more green arsenical flakes from the ivy on the wall. You realise that in this city even the attempts to improve your life are traps. The wallpaper that provides moral elevation is a poison. The laws that forbid cellar dwellings only succeed in turning your neighbours into legal ghosts. The system creates a set of rules that look beautiful on parchment, but feel like sandpaper on your skin. You sit back down, feeling the metallic weight of the air in your chest, and you watch the green ivy on the wall rustle in the draught, a rhythmic, whispering reminder that in the Victorian tenement, even the flowers are trying to kill you. The leaden afternoon has reached its lowest point, and the temperature in your room has entered a phase of clammy stagnation. The humidity from your drying laundry has merged with the cold draft from the warped floorboards, creating a microclimate that feels like being wrapped in a wet wool blanket that was once used to put out a fire. You are preparing to eat your main meal. But in 1865, the housing of the poor rules have effectively outlawed the concept of a home-cooked dinner. You see, the building codes and fire regulations of the era have a very specific, very frustrating relationship with domestic flues. Because your room was never intended to be an independent dwelling, it lacks a proper oven. You have a small open iron grate, the Huddle fire, which is excellent for boiling a kettle or singeing a sausage, but utterly useless for baking a loaf of bread or roasting a joint of meat. The rules of the Metropolitan Fire Brigade state that unregulated ovens in tenements are menace to the safety of the parish, yet the system offers no alternative but the public bakehouse rule. You pick up your heavy tin baking dish. The texture of the metal is greasy and cold, covered in a permanent patina of burnt fat and soot that no amount of greyish pump water can remove. Inside the dish is your Sunday luxury. Though today is not Sunday, it is a small pale piece of mutton neck surrounded by half-frozen potatoes. You wrap the dish in a scrap of burlap to protect your hands, and the sound of the tin hitting the table, a sharp, ringing tang, echoes through the room, drawing the silent, hungry gaze of everyone sharing your space. You step out into the hallway, and the smell of the house changes. It is the smell of the collective feast. Because no one in these 60 rooms can cook for themselves, the hallway is a sensory map of the district's poverty. You smell the heavy cabbage water steam of the ground floor, the sharp, fishy tang of the second floor, and the unmistakable burnt toast aroma of a hearth that hasn't been swept in a decade. You breathe in, and the air is thick with the culinary haze, a mixture of food smoke and damp brick that leaves a savoury, oily taste on your tongue. You step onto the street, heading for the local baker. The texture under your boots is the London slime, a mixture of pulverised stone, horse manure and coal ash that has the consistency of wet clay. The rules of the Metropolitan Board of Works dictate that streets should be scavenged twice a week, but the scavengers rarely enter your alley. They prefer the wide paved boulevards of the West End, where the respectable citizens don't have to dodge the overflow of a tenement cesspool. You reach the bakehouse and the temperature shifts dramatically. It is a blasting dry heat that hits your face like a physical blow. The air is filled with the smell of charitable roasting, the scent of 100 different dinners all baking in the same cavernous brick oven. It is a smell of singed fat, yeast, and the metallic tang of the massive iron oven doors. You breathe in, and the heat dries the moisture on your eyes instantly, making your breath feel thin and scorched. The sound of the bakehouse is a rhythmic, mechanical chaos. You hear the clack, clack, clack of the baker's wooden peel sliding across the stone floor of the oven, the sharp hiss of fat dripping into the coals, and the constant, impatient shouting of names. In 1865, the Lord's Day Observance Society has lobbied for rules that forbid you from working on the Sabbath, yet they graciously allow the bakers to stay open for 2 hours so the poor can have their food cooked. They call this the benevolence of the trade, while you call it paying a penny for the privilege of not having your own kitchen. The baker takes your dish with a grunt of indifference. He marks your tin with a piece of chalk, a dry, scratching sound against the metal. The texture of the bakehouse floor is a thick layer of white flour and black soot, a monochrome carpet that muffles the footsteps of the dozens of women waiting for their dinners. You stand in the heat, your breath coming in shallow, careful gasps. You are a subject of a housing system that decided you weren't domestic enough to own an oven, turning the act of eating into a municipal transaction. As you wait, you hear the distant, hollow dong-dong-dong of the parish clock. It is a sound that measures the baker's time and your hunger. You realise that your entire nutritional life is governed by a man with a wooden paddle and a set of fire safety bylaws written by people who have never had to carry their raw dinner through a rainstorm. The air in the bakehouse is a swirling map of other people's lives, the steam of a neighbour's beef, the smoke of the baker's coal, and the dry white dust of the grain. You wait for your turn, feeling the heat of the oven press against your chest, a rhythmic, glowing reminder that in the Victorian city, even your hunger follows a schedule dictated by the fear of a fire you didn't start. You return to your room, your dinner in hand, but the blasting heat of the bakehouse is already a fading memory. the temperature in your tenement is settling back into its default state, a heavy, unmoving damp that seems to draw the warmth right out of your skin. You are thirsty. But in 1865, the act of drinking is a high-stakes game governed by the intermittent supply rule. You see, the water in your district isn't a constant flow. It is a municipal mercy delivered by private water companies who believe that providing 2-4 hour hydration to the poor would only encourage wasteful habits. According to the rules of the Waterworks Clauses Act, the company is only required to turn on the mains for 20 minutes a day, usually at some unpredictable hour in the afternoon. This creates the Great Scramble, a daily ritual of survival where the neighbourhood's morality is tested by the speed of a lead pipe. You head back down to the courtyard, and the smell of the stagnant water butt hits you. It is a flat, metallic odour mixed with the scent of green decay, the smell of algae and ancient sediment that has settled at the bottom of the shared wooden cistern. You breathe in, and the air feels thin and watery, carrying the faint swampy scent of the courtyard's damp corners. Your breath is steady, but your eyes are fixed on the dry iron mouth of the communal pipe. Suddenly you hear it, a deep thundering clunk gurgle hiss, the sound of the turncock opening the valve 3 streets away. It is a mechanical scream as the air is forced out of the pipes by the incoming pressure. The sound triggers a frantic clatter of buckets and the rhythmic slap, slap, slap of bare feet on the wet flagstones. The texture of the water butt is repulsive. You reach out to steady yourself, and your hand brushes against the interior wall of the cistern. It is coated in a thick, velvety slime, a biological carpet of moss and mystery that thrives in the darkness. The rules of the Metropolitan Water Act state that cisterns should be properly covered and cleansed, yet your landlord's idea of a cover is a rotting piece of sailcloth that has become a nursery for London's fly population. You plunge your bucket into the gushing flow. The water is cold, a sharp stinging freeze that turns your knuckles a bruised purple. But as you look at the bucket, you notice the industrial fleck. The water is filled with tiny dancing particles of rust and a fine white silt that gives it a gritty texture on your tongue. The elite members of the Temperance Society stand on their soapboxes in Hyde Park, holding up crystal carafes of filtered spring water and urging you to abandon the demon gin for the purity of the pump. They believe that water is the nectar of the virtuous. Yet they never mention that your virtuous nectar is delivered through a lead-lined tank that sits 4 feet away from a leaking cesspool. The sound of the water is a roaring, chaotic gush that drowns out the voices of your neighbours. Splosh, dud, slop. It is the sound of a district trying to capture enough life to last until tomorrow afternoon. Then, as quickly as it began, the gush turns into a trickle, and then a final wheezing thup. The water is gone. The mains are closed. The company has fulfilled its 20-minute obligation to the great unwashed. You carry your bucket back up the groaning stairs. The texture of the air in the stairwell is heavy and carries the metallic tang of the lead pipes. You realise that your entire relationship with hydration is a series of intermittent favours granted by men who view your thirst as a line item on a profit and loss sheet. The rules are followed, the water was turned on, and the statistics will show that your parish is supplied. You sit back at your table, looking at the cloudy, greyish liquid in your cup. It is the drink of the rule book, a biological gamble sanctioned by the state. You take a swallow, feeling the grit of the silt catch in your throat, a sharp rhythmic reminder that in the Victorian city, even the water you drink is subject to the cold, restricted flow of a monopoly that doesn't care if you ever feel truly clean. The evening has settled into a state of humid exhaustion. The temperature in your room has plateaued. a stagnant, heavy warmth that carries the moisture of the day's laundry and the lingering steam of the mutton dinner. You are trying to find a moment of mental quiet, but in 1865 the housing of the industrial classes rules have ensured that privacy is a physical impossibility. You are currently living under the acoustic membrane rule, a byproduct of a system that views your walls not as barriers, but as the thinnest possible dividers between taxable units. You lean back against the wall, and the texture is a vibrating, porous chill. Because your tenement was built on the cheap, the internal partitions are often just a single layer of lath and plaster or a half-brick wall. You can feel the house breathing. You breathe in, and the air is thick with the dust of the inhabited, a fine powdery mixture of pulverized lime, textile fibers, and dried mud. It is a sensory map of everyone you live with, a mixture of 100 different lives processed into a single grey atmosphere. The sound in your room is an intrusive, multi-layered roar. You hear the neighbour's life as clearly as your own. Through the left wall, there is the rhythmic thud scrape of a cobbler's hammer. Through the right, the sharp, shrill yell and thud of a family argument over a lost sixpence. Above you, the heavy, rhythmic creak groan of the floorboards measures the pacing of a man who cannot sleep. In 1865, your housing rules have created a world where you are a permanent, unwilling witness to the struggles of strangers. The elite members of the Society for the Prevention of Public Nuisances meet in soundproofed libraries with velvet curtains and thick Persian rugs. They write long, annoyed letters to the Times about the unruly clamour of the rookeries. They believe that the poor are naturally loud, that you enjoy the chaos. They pass nuisance removal acts that give the police the power to fine you for excessive vocalisation or unseemly industry after hours. But their rules never account for the architecture of the echo. The system has built you a drum and then blamed you for the noise it makes. You close your eyes and the sound of the house becomes a mechanical symphony. You hear the rhythmic clack, clack, clack of a sweater's needle from the room below. This is the sweating system, a rule of the Victorian economy that dictates you must turn your home into a factory just to keep the roof over your head. The woman downstairs is sewing waistcoats for a West End tailor, earning a penny a garment. The sound of her needle hitting the thimble is a sharp, metallic tink-tink, a rhythmic heartbeat that never stops, even at midnight. The smell of the hallway filters through the gap in your door. It is the smell of the work at home, the scent of glue from the matchbox makers, the sharp chemical tang of the artificial flower dye, and the dusty, dry odour of the cheap wool being turned into high fashion. You breathe out a long, weary huff, and you realise that in this city, your domestic rules have abolished the boundary between rest and labour. Your home is a workshop, your bed is a sorting table, and your air is an industrial byproduct. The texture of the air on your skin is prickling and dry despite the damp walls. It is an air that feels charged with the friction of too many bodies in too small a space. You are a resident of a bureaucracy that demanded industrial efficiency and delivered a hive. You listen to the rhythmic, desperate sewing machine of the neighbour, a sound like a distant, iron insect chewing through the silence. You realise that in the Victorian tenement, peace and quiet is a luxury taxed even more heavily than the light. You sit in the dark, feeling the vibration of the house in your very bones, a rhythmic, groaning reminder that you are just one more cog in a brick-lined machine that never sleeps and never lets you dream in peace. The coal in your grate has collapsed into a heap of glowing orange-veined embers, and the temperature in your room has begun its nightly retreat. This is the hour of the sinking frost. In 1865, the heat doesn't just leave, it is actively evicted by the porosity rule. Because your house was built with the cheapest, most underbaked bricks available, the walls don't hold the warmth. They act as a filter for the night air. You can feel the cold moving in, a slow invisible tide that starts at your ankles and crawls toward your chest. You move to the window, the one that isn't bricked up, and the smell of London evening seeps through the cracks. It is the scent of 1,000,000 dying fires, a heavy carbon-rich perfume of smoke, damp ash, and the metallic tang of the frozen mud in the street below. You breathe in, and the air is like a thin, cold broth that feels sharp against your windpipe. It is a rhythmic, frosty intake of breath that reminds you that you are living in a city that has mastered the art of industrializing the climate. The texture of the glass is a marvel of unintentional design. It is crown glass, thin and rippled, with a greasy film of soot on the outside and a layer of crystalline frost forming on the inside. You run your finger across the pane and the ice is jagged and brittle, melting into a cold, dirty smear under the heat of your touch. The rules of the Metropolitan Improvements Act state that every dwelling should have sound and weather-tight glazing, yet your window rattles in its frame like a set of loose teeth every time the wind catches the corner of the building. The sound of the evening is the rhythmic, hollow clop-clop of a hansom cab taking a wealthy patron back to the warmth of Kensington. The sound echoes off the narrow walls of your alley, amplified by the cold, damp air. You hear the distant, melodic chime of a church clock, bong, 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 a sound that feels heavy and solemn, as if the time itself has been weighted with lead. In 1865, your life is governed by the rule of the shared hour. You don't own a watch, so you live by the sounds of the parish, your every movement dictated by a bell you can't see. The elite members of the Society for the Encouragement of Cleanliness Among the Poor often distribute tracts advising you to keep your floors scrubbed to prevent the harbouring of miasmas. They write rules about domestic hygiene, as if a wooden brush and a bit of sand could undo the fact that your floorboards were salvaged from a rotting barge. The texture of the wood under your feet is a nightmare of splintered history. It is uneven, soft with dry rot in places, and hard as iron in others. You breathe out, and your breath is a small, ghostly cloud in the dim light of the dying embers. You reach for the slop jar in the corner, the rule of the unseen plumbing. In 1865, the building codes have a very polite way of ignoring the reality of the night, because the shared privy in the courtyard is a dark, fly-ridden trap. The law of the tenement dictates that you use a ceramic jar throughout the night. The smell is a sharp, ammonia-heavy odour that lingers in the stagnant air of the room. The rules of public health state that all waste should be removed daily, yet the architecture of your house provides no way to do this without carrying your shame through the common hallway, past your neighbours and down the groaning stairs. The sound of the house settling for the night is a rhythmic wooden groan. You hear the quick snap of the rafters cooling, the soft thump of a neighbour setting down their boots, and the low-frequency vibration of the distant railway. You are a subject of the density rule. The system has cleared out the slums to make way for the new iron tracks, pushing 10,000 people into the 5,000 houses that remain. The result is a city that is physically straining against its own rules, a world where the walls are always too close and the air is always too old. The texture of the air on your tongue is dusty and carries the faint taste of the London smog. You feel the pressure of the night, the weight of the city's regulations, and the intrusive, constant sound of the neighbours. You are a resident of a bureaucracy that prioritises the flow of capital over the flow of oxygen. You sit on the floor, leaning against the cold weeping stone, and you listen to the rhythmic dying hiss of the coal fire. You realise that in the Victorian tenement, the rules of the house are simply the bars of a brick-lined cage that was designed to hold you just long enough for you to return to the factory in the morning. The embers in the grate have finally turned to a silent chalky grey, and the temperature in your room has surrendered entirely to the night. This is the damp thaw. The heat from your body and the dying fire has pulled the moisture out of the porous brick walls, and now that the air is cooling, it's raining inside. You can feel it on your face, a fine microscopic mist that smells of ancient mortar and the metallic tang of the London fog. You breathe in, and the air is heavy and limp, carrying the texture of a wet cellar into the back of your throat. You move toward the door, feeling the need for the small mercy of the hallway. In 1865, the rules of the common area are a masterpiece of legal evasion. You see, according to the Metropolitan Buildings Act, your landlord is responsible for the structural integrity of your room, because that is what you pay for. But the hallway, the stairs, and the landings, those are non-revenue spaces. The rule of the tenement is that if a space doesn't generate rent, it doesn't deserve maintenance. You step out into the landing, and the sound is a hollow, cavernous echo. The temperature here is a transient cold, a drafty, moving chill that travels up the central spine of the house like a ghost. You reach for the banister to guide yourself in the pitch blackness, and the texture is repulsive. It is tenement grease, a thick, waxy build-up of 1,000 unwashed hands, soot, and the oily residue of the cheap tallow lamps used by the few residents who can afford them. Your fingers slide over the wood, which feels slick and unnaturally warm, as if the house itself is sweating. The smell of the hallway is the collective exhalation. Because the housing of the poor rules have removed the windows from these central shafts to save on glass and tax, the air has been sitting here since the building was subdivided in the 1840s. It is the scent of 100 different lives, the sour smell of a newborn's linens, the sharp ammonia of a chamber pot, the heavy sweet rot of a damp floorboard, and the pervasive dry odour of coal dust. You breathe in, and the air feels used, an oxygen-starved vapour that makes your head swim. The sounds of the stairs are a rhythmic, splintering protest. Snap, groan. Every step you take is a gamble with the rule of scantling. To save money during the industrial expansion, the builders used deal wood, soft, fast-growing pine that was never meant to bear the weight of 20 families. You can hear the floorboards above you bowing under the weight of a heavy chest of drawers. The sound is a slow, rhythmic squeonk that vibrates in the stone walls. In the tenement, gravity is a constant threat, and the building codes have done nothing but ensure the collapse will be economical. The elite members of the General Board of Health sit in their high-ceilinged offices in Whitehall, surrounded by fresh-cut flowers and the smell of beeswax polish. They write long, concerned reports about the lack of ventilation in the common parts of dwellings for the labouring classes. They believe that if they mandate a minimum landing width, they can solve the problem of urban decay. They write rules about egress and ingress, but they never mention the blind man's staircase, the fact that the rules allow a landlord to leave the hallways in total, lightless darkness to save on gas. To the system, your safety is a luxury feature that isn't included in the base price of your poverty. You reach the first floor landing, and your breath hitches as you hear a soft, rhythmic thump, thump, thump from the darkness below. It is the night soul of the building, a stray dog or perhaps a mudlark who has snuck in to escape the frost on the riverbanks. The sound echoes up the stairwell, amplified by the hollow walls, a reminder that in this city, even a hallway is a contested territory. The texture of the air here is gritty. A fine black silt is falling from the ceiling where the plaster has cracked, a falling soot that coats your hair and shoulders like a dark funeral shroud. You realise that your entire movement through the house is a journey through unregulated space, The rules are strict about your room, but they are silent about the path you take to reach it. You are a resident of a bureaucracy that has mapped every square inch of your bed, but has left the stairs to rot in the shadows. You stand on the landing, feeling the vibration of the city's heart, the distant rumble of the docks and the hiss of the steam pipes, a rhythmic industrial pulse that never lets the building truly rest. You take a breath, feeling the used, dusty air of the hallway fill your chest, and you realize that in the Victorian tenement, the common areas are simply the arteries of a brick-lined beast that is slowly suffocating on its own rules. You pull the heavy, warped door of your room shut, and the sound is a wet, muffled thud that doesn't quite seal out the hallway's chill. The temperature in your room has entered the hour of the clammy stagnation. The warmth you generated by boiling your dinner and kindling your fire has been absorbed by the moisture in the air, creating a microclimate that feels like being wrapped in a cold, damp sponge. You are standing in what the housing of the labouring classes rules describe as a separate dwelling, but in 1865, your room is actually just a fragment of a dead house's corpse. You move your hand along the partition wall, the one that separates you from the family of 8 in room 12. The texture is frighteningly fragile. It is lath and plaster partitioning, the cheapest method of subdivision allowed by the Metropolitan Building Act. Behind the peeling arsenical wallpaper is a skeleton of thin wooden strips, held together by a mixture of lime, sand, and horsehair. You can feel the wall vibrate when the child in the next room coughs. It is a house built of thinness, a world where the rules dictated that if you could fit a bed in a space, you could call it a home. The smell of the room has shifted to the scent of the subdivided. It is the smell of ancient animal glue fermenting in the damp, the sharp tang of the neighbour's porpoise tobacco filtering through the cracks in the lath, and the persistent heavy musk of unwashed wool. You breathe in, and the air feels slow. It's a low-oxygen atmosphere that makes your lungs work harder for every rhythmic, shallow intake. The elite architects of the building societies write long self-congratulatory essays about maximising urban occupancy, but their math never accounts for the fact that a room meant for one person's breath cannot support the lives of 6. The sound in your room is the symphony of the partition, because the rules allowed the landlord to divide a single grand 18th century bedroom into 4 separate revenue units. The acoustic life of the tenement is a shared burden. You hear the rhythmic scritch-scratch of a quill next door, the heavy thump-thud of a chair being moved, and the soft, sibilant whisper-whisper of a secret you were never meant to hear. In the tenement, the rules have abolished the concept of the inner life. You are a biological prisoner of your neighbour's schedule, your rest dictated by the thickness of a horsehair plaster wall. The elite members of the Royal Institute of British Architects meet in halls of marble and mahogany to discuss the art of the floor plan. They write rules about partition stability and fire spread prevention, but they never mention the social friction of the thin wall. The way living in a space where you can hear a stranger's every sigh erodes the very soul. The bureaucracy has legislated a world of permanent intrusion. To the system, you are not a person who needs privacy. You are a tenant occupant who needs to be fit into a grid. You sit on the edge of your bed, and the texture of the floor is a nightmare of uneven settling. The floorboards, which were once level, now tilt toward the centre of the building, following the curve of the rotting joists below. You can hear the rhythmic creak groan of the house as it fights the weight of the 100 souls it was never designed to hold. You are a subject of the division of space rule, a law of the market that says it is more profitable to sell a man a slice of a room than a whole house. The texture of the air on your tongue is metallic and carries the dry, chalky taste of the crumbling plaster. You feel the weight of the city's greed, the weight of the porous brick, and the intrusive, rhythmic sound of the neighbours pacing. You are a resident of a bureaucracy that prioritises the yield per square foot over the dignity of the inhabitant. You lie back on your straw, feeling the house groan in the night wind. A rhythmic, splintering reminder that in the Victorian tenement, the rules of the house have turned the concept of a sanctuary into a hollow, echoing joke. You reach out in the darkness and your fingers brush against the cold, unyielding surface of a thin iron bar. This is your bed frame. Or, as the elite reformers of the Metropolitan Association for Improving the Dwellings of the Industrious Classes call it, the instrument of sanitary progress. The temperature of the iron is a biting, conductive cold that seems to actively pull the heat from your hand. In 1865, your rest is governed by the iron bedstead rule, a mandate born from a bureaucratic obsession with the lice of the nation. For decades, the poor slept on wooden box beds or simple timber frames, but the rules of the new model dwellings and the public health committees have declared wood to be a moral and biological hazard. They believe that the porous grain of the timber provides a sanctuary for the unchristian parasite. Consequently, the housing rules for improved tenements state that only non-porous iron may be used for sleeping quarters. It sounds like a victory for hygiene, a step toward a vermin-free empire, yet the rule ignores the thermal betrayal of the material. In a room with no insulation and a dying fire, the iron bedstead acts as a heat sink, ensuring that your sleep is a 4 shilling a week exercise in mild hypothermia. The smell of the bed is the scent of the varnish rule. To prevent the iron from rusting in the permanent London indoor fog, the frame is coated in a thick black bitumen paint. It is a heavy industrial odour, the smell of a coal tar pit mixed with the sharp metallic tang of the cold iron. You breathe in and the air feels chemically edged, a sensory reminder that your very rest has been industrialized. The elite physicians write long, glowing papers about how the iron transition will eradicate the typhus flea, but they never mention the iron ache, the way the cold metal saps the strength from your joints until you wake up feeling like a rusted machine yourself. The sound of your bed is a rhythmic metallic protest, because the frame was built to the cheapest tender rule. The joints are loose and the iron is thin. Every time you shift your weight, the bed gives a high-pitched, piercing scree-onk that echoes off the weeping stone walls. It is a mechanical cry that alerts everyone in the room to your every movement. You can hear the neighbour's bedstead through the thin partition, a rhythmic, answering creak-snap that forms a dialogue of shared discomfort. In the tenement, the rules of 1865 have replaced the soft silence of the country with the percussive discord of the factory. The elite members of the vestry committee are currently debating the lodgers' register. They believe that if they can just record the name and moral status of every soul in your building, they can maintain the order of the parish. The rule states that your landlord must keep a ledger of occupancy at the front door. This is the bureaucracy of the threshold, a system that ensures that you are never just a resident but always a registered unit. To enter your own home, you must follow the rule of public visibility, your presence documented by a man with a greasy quill and a suspicious eye. The texture of the air on your skin is clammy and carries the dry, ashy taste of the coal dust. You feel the weight of the parish's surveillance, the weight of the iron frame, and the intrusive rhythmic sound of the city's night soul. You are a resident of a world where improvement is a set of rules that prioritize the eradication of the flea over the comfort of the human. You lie back against the iron, feeling the cold metal press against your spine, a rhythmic, chilling reminder that in the Victorian city, even your bed is a municipal regulation designed to keep you sanitary at the cost of your soul. You watch the frost fall on the iron bar in the dim light, a tiny, glittering forest that grows in the silence of a house that is too cold to breathe and too loud to sleep. The light from your tallow dip is failing, guttering down into a pool of translucent yellow fat that smells of the slaughterhouse and a long dead wick. The temperature in the room has reached a state of static frost, a deep, penetrating cold that has finally defeated the residual warmth of your body. You reach out to the small table and touch the most important object in your life, the rent book. The texture of the cover is a cheap, waxy cardboard, stained with the circular marks of 100 damp mugs and the greasy thumbprints of a decade of desperation. In 1865, your survival is dictated by the rule of the weekly tenancy. You see, the legal geniuses in the Inns of Court have crafted a system that ensures you have no more roots than a piece of tumbleweed in a gale. Unlike the wealthy families in the West End who sign 99-year leases and treat their houses like ancestral fortresses, you are a subject of short-term tenure. The rule states that your landlord can evict you with exactly 7 days' notice for any reason, or no reason at all. This is the bureaucracy of the precipice, a law that ensures every breath you take in this room is a temporary favour granted by a man you have never met. You open the book, and the smell of indebtedness wafts from the pages. It is the scent of old damp paper, cheap iron gall ink, and the pervasive dry odour of the landlord's ledger. You breathe in, and the air feels tight, a sensory manifestation of the financial pressure that constricts your chest every Saturday morning. You hear your own breath, a rhythmic, anxious huff in the darkness as you remember the sound of the rent collector's step. It is a rhythmic, heavy thud, thud, thud that moves through the building like a mechanical pulse. You hear it on the stairs, the sound of polished calf skin hitting the rotting pine, and every room in the tenement falls silent, holding its breath in unison. The elite members of the Property Protection Society meet in rooms with velvet-lined walls to discuss the sanctity of the contract. They write long academic papers about the right to a fair return on investment. They believe that if they didn't have the power to throw you into the street, you would become morally decadent and shiftless. To them, the threat of homelessness is a necessary goad to industriousness. The texture of the rent itself is a physical burden. You reach into your pocket and pull out the few coins you have managed to scrape together. The metal is cold and gritty, the copper of the rulebook.
These coins are slick with the sweat of the factory floor and the grime of the docks.
You set them on the table, and the sound, a dull metallic clink, is the smallest, most pathetic sound in London, yet it is the only thing that keeps the walls from closing in on you. The housing rules of 1865 state that the landlord is entitled to distress for rent. This is the rule of the bailiff, a law that gives him the right to enter your room and take everything you own if you are even an hour late with your 4 shillings. They can take the kettle, they can take the blanket off your child, they can even take the mattress from under you. The texture of the law is absolute seizure. The bureaucracy has decided that the rights of the brick are higher than the rights of the bone. You hear the rhythmic scritch-scratch of the collector's quill in the hallway as he marks another family as deficient. The sound is like a needle on glass, a sharp, abrasive noise that measures the proximity of the gutter. You realise that in the Victorian city your home is simply a deferred eviction. The rules have ensured that you can never save, never plan, and never breathe without checking the ledger. The air in the room is stagnant and carries the dry, chalky taste of the crumbling plaster. You feel the weight of the market, the weight of the law, and the intrusive rhythmic sound of the city's greed. You are a resident of a system that views tenancy as a form of social control, a way to keep the labouring orders in a state of permanent, productive anxiety. You sit on the edge of your bed, feeling the house creak in the night wind, a rhythmic, splintering reminder that in the Victorian tenement, the rules of the house are simply the terms of a surrender that you have to sign every 7 days, just to keep from freezing to death in the fog. You watch the final spark of your tallow dip vanish, leaving you in a total regulated darkness, listening to the rhythmic, retreating footsteps of the rent collector as he carries the city's peace away in his pocket. The night has reached its deepest, most hollow point, the hour where the temperature in your room is indistinguishable from the temperature of the stone hallway. This is the hour of the silent law. In 1865, the rules of the city have finally gone quiet, but their weight is heavier than ever. You are lying in the dark, and as your eyes adjust to the absence of the tallow dip's glow, you realize that you are living under the rule of the model dwelling. You see, the elite reformers of the Metropolitan Association have spent the last decade building improved industrial dwellings, brick and iron monuments to the Christian character of the labouring classes. They look magnificent from the outside, tidy red brick blocks with arched entrances and shared courtyards. But the rules for living in these palaces of the poor are a masterpiece of social castration. To earn a spot in a model dwelling, the rule book dictates that you must have no pets, no children over the age of 12 sharing your room, no unseemly visitors after 9 o'clock, and absolutely no spirituous liquors. The texture of this improved life is a sterile, supervised perfection, a world where the landlord isn't just a rent collector, but a moral guardian who checks the polish on your shoes and the frequency of your prayers. You breathe in, and the air in your current, unimproved room feels rebellious by comparison. It smells of the free order, a mixture of the neighbour's illicit gin, the sharp tang of the stray cat that sleeps in the rafters, and the heavy, sulphurous musk of the London night. Your breath is a slow, rhythmic puff of white vapour, a small cloud of defiance against the sanitary laws that seek to regulate your very soul. The sound of the night is a rhythmic, low hum throb, the city's industrial heart pumping the lifeblood of capital through the iron veins of the railway. Suddenly you hear a sound that makes your fingers tighten around the scratchy wool of your blanket. It is the rule of the demolition order. In 1865, the Metropolitan Board of Works has decided that your district is a moral and biological blight. They have passed a rule that allows them to clear the ground for the new boulevards and the high-speed trains. You hear the rhythmic thud-clink scrape of the surveyor's chain in the street below. To the elite, slum clearance is a victory for progress and public health. To you, it is the rule of the displaced ghost. The system knocks down the 5-shilling rooms to build 10-shilling artisan flats, and the math of the rule book dictates that you must move into a cellar 2 parishes over. In Victorian London, improvement is a bulldozer driven by a man in a top hat, and the rules ensure that you are always in its path. The texture of the morning is beginning to return. The mustard fog is thickening against the ripple glass, a heavy yellow atmosphere that carries the scent of the first factory chimneys being stoked. It is the smell of the industrial sunrise, a nose-stinging mixture of coal gas, hot oil, and the metallic tang of the Thames mud. You breathe in, and you can feel the grit of the soot settling into the corners of your eyes, a texture like fine volcanic ash. The sound of the city is accelerating into its daily, mechanical roar. You hear the first factory hooter, a long mournful wayon that vibrates through the bricks and into your very teeth. It is the rule of the steam whistle, a sound that abolishes the concept of the private mourning. In the tenement, the rules of 1865 have synchronized your pulse with the rhythm of the piston. You hear the rhythmic clatterbang of the first iron-wheeled carts hitting the cobblestones, the sharp clink of a milk can, and the distant rhythmic stomp, stomp, stomp of thousands of boots heading toward the docks. You sit up, and the texture of the air is one of unresolved density. You feel the pressure of the city's laws, the weight of the damp wool, and the intrusive, constant sound of 100 strangers waking up on the other side of your thin horsehair walls. You are a biological survivor of a housing system that was designed to maximize your productive capacity while minimizing your cubic requirements. The rules were written to civilize you, yet they have only succeeded in making the act of existing feel like an act of trespass. You stand up, your joints giving that familiar, rhythmic pop snap as you face the grey leaden light of another London day. The good news? You're alive. The bad news? The rules of 1865 are waiting for you at the doorstep, measuring your breath, taxing your light, and regulating your filth until the sun goes down again. You take one last heavy breath of the room's stagnant, soot-heavy air, a rhythmic intake of industrial history, and you realise that in the Victorian city, home is simply the space between two laws that haven't quite crushed you yet. You listen to the house groan as the first neighbour opens their door, a sound like a great wooden ship finally breaking apart on the rocks of a bureaucracy that never learned how to forgive. You have survived the brick and the cold. You have navigated the maze of rules, the damp frost and the heavy yellow fog. Now you get to rest. Let the quiet of the modern night wrap around you, not as a threat, but as a blanket. Let the stillness fill your mind. The coal smoke has faded, the factory whistles are silent, and the inspectors have closed their ledgers. The story is over. The work is done. Sleep well. The past isn't going anywhere. It will be there, locked in its shadowed rooms, if you ever want to visit again. But for now, just drift. Good night.